Gavin Newsom looked straight at JD Vance and delivered the line like a man who had rehearsed it in front of mirrors, donors, consultants, and cameras for years, telling him that people leave Ohio for California because California represents the future while Ohio represents the past. The smile was enormous, polished, presidential, the kind of smile designed to survive a close-up and make 9 million viewers believe confidence itself was evidence. Newsom did not merely defend California, he used California as a weapon, turning geography into hierarchy and migration into a political insult aimed directly at the vice president sitting across from him. He expected Vance to take the bait, defend Ohio, argue about factories, families, communities, history, pride, and every emotional subject that would keep the conversation safely inside Newsom's preferred frame. Vance did none of it, because instead of defending Ohio, he opened his laptop and reduced the entire performance to something much harder to charm away: one number. That number was attached to a $19 million public relations contract paid for with taxpayer money. Money, Vance argued, had been spent not to repair California's problems, but to rehabilitate California's image while those problems remained exactly where they were. The effect was immediate because the contrast was impossible to miss. Newsom had arrived selling a future, while Vance had arrived carrying a ledger. The town hall itself looked polished enough: fresh paint, rented furniture, carefully placed cameras, the clean antiseptic atmosphere of a convention center temporarily converted into a national political stage, but none of that polish could change what appeared on the laptop. Newsom stood before sitting, filling the space with the practiced physical confidence that had become part of his political identity: charcoal suit perfect, hair perfect, teeth perfect, every movement communicating that he understood television and expected television to understand him. Vance, already seated with the laptop open, looked less like a political performer than a man reviewing an account where the numbers had stopped matching the explanation. Newsom began with the California he always wanted the country to see: enormous GDP, global technology power, climate legislation, electric vehicles, public investment, innovation, and the repeated promise that California was not simply another state, but the place where America's future was already happening. He said innovation again and again, returned repeatedly to the future, and presented California as proof that progressive governance could produce a model the rest of the country would eventually follow. The supporters who had traveled from Sacramento, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and other parts of California applauded exactly where his political instincts told him they would, responding to the familiar version of Newsom that had carried him through 2 gubernatorial elections. Then he turned toward Vance and widened the smile, moving from selling California to diminishing Ohio, saying the vice president came from a state people left so they could move west. The argument was simple, theatrical, and designed for television. California attracts, Ohio loses. Therefore, California works and Ohio does not. Vance refused the emotional argument entirely and instead answered with migration data, saying that whatever may once have been true about people leaving Ohio for California was no longer the reality he wanted the audience to examine. Since 2020, he said, California had lost more than 800,000 residents through net migration, with people moving to Texas, Florida, Arizona, Nevada, and even Ohio. That was the first visible problem for Newsom because the attack he had built depended on an old image of California as the destination and Ohio as the departure gate, while Vance was insisting that the direction of movement had changed. Newsom's smile remained in place, but the eyes stopped moving with it, creating the first separation between the performance and the reaction underneath it. Vance then moved directly into the subject he had clearly prepared to prosecute with dates, memos, orders, and dollar amounts rather than slogans about the future. On March 14, 2020, California's Employment Development Department Fraud Prevention Team sent a warning to the governor's office about removing identity verification requirements from unemployment claims. The warning was direct. Eliminating those protections would create significant fraud exposure and was not recommended. 25 days later, on April 8th, Governor Newsom signed the executive order associated with the policy described as Pay Now, Verify Later, a policy under which claims would be paid first and verification would follow afterward. The sequence mattered because Vance was not arguing about political philosophy anymore. He was putting two dates beside each other and asking the audience to look at what happened between them. March 14th was the warning, April 8th was the signature, and 25 days separated professional advice from executive action. The consequence Vance placed on the screen was $32.6 billion in fraudulent unemployment claims, a number large enough to make every earlier line about branding, innovation, and political image suddenly feel embarrassingly small. Roughly $20 billion of that money, according to the presentation, involved federal CARES Act funds administered by the state, which moved the discussion beyond ordinary administrative embarrassment and into a much more serious argument about responsibility for federal money. Vance cited 18 U.S.C. Section 666 and described the legal exposure associated with knowingly permitting fraud or willfully failing to prevent it in federally funded programs. He was careful to frame the point through the policy sequence. The fraud team warned the administration, the verification requirement was removed anyway, and then the system absorbed losses on a scale that no public relations language could disguise. This was no longer California versus Ohio. It was a question of whether basic safeguards were deliberately removed after the danger had already been identified. The most grotesque example was the money sent to inmates, including people incarcerated for murder, rape, and other serious crimes, individuals who obviously had no jobs to lose because they were already inside prisons. According to the figures presented, approximately $1 billion in unemployment benefits went to inmates, an outcome Vance tied directly to a system that no longer performed the verification capable of identifying those applicants as incarcerated. The simplicity of that explanation made it brutal. Inmates were paid because the system failed to check information that would have revealed they were inmates. A woman in the gallery wearing a San Bernardino County employee lanyard put a hand over her mouth, while another attendee in a Caltrans jacket shifted in his seat, small reactions made larger by the weight of the number just presented. Newsom was no longer controlling the visual rhythm of the room because the screen had taken over, and the screen did not smile. Then Vance gave the statistics a human name. Ray Morales, a taco shop owner from San Bernardino who had spent 22 years building his business before becoming an identity theft victim inside the same unemployment system. A criminal used Ray's name and social security number to file a fraudulent claim and received $14,000, but when Ray later needed legitimate unemployment assistance, the system told him that he had already received benefits. He then spent 8 months proving that he was actually himself, nearly lost his house, and watched his credit score collapse to 580, where, according to the account presented, it had still not recovered 6 years later. Ray's case mattered because it converted administrative failure into a direct personal consequence. The system paid the criminal first and forced the actual citizen to carry the burden of correcting the state's mistake. The policy called Pay Now, Verify Later had moved from an executive phrase into a real sequence of damage attached to one person's name, one stolen identity, one $14,000 claim, and 8 months of trying to prove reality to a system that had already paid the fraud. Vance said Ray was not an isolated case, but one of 47,000 identity theft victims connected to California's EDD system, including teachers, nurses, and small business owners whose names had been used while real benefits were denied or delayed. Those victims represented the part of the fraud number politicians rarely advertise, because the loss was not limited to public money disappearing from an account. It also included destroyed credit, denied assistance, months of bureaucratic combat, and families forced to absorb consequences they did not create. 6 years after the original fraud explosion, the California State Auditor still classified EDD as a high-risk agency because the improvements had been insufficient. That detail stripped away the easiest defense available to Newsom, because a crisis in 2020 could be described as emergency chaos, but a high-risk designation continuing into January 2026 pointed to something far more damaging: a failure that had remained unresolved long after the emergency itself. 6 years later, the warning light was still on. Newsom's hands began moving even while he was not speaking, as if his body was searching for the rebuttal before his words had found one. His right hand rose as though a point was coming, stayed suspended for a moment, then fell without delivering the argument the gesture appeared ready to introduce. Under 14 cameras, that unfinished motion became more revealing than a polished answer because the entire debate had shifted from the territory where Newsom was strongest, presentation, cadence, confidence, aspiration, into the territory where performance could not erase dates. Vance kept working through the material the same way, tab after tab, number after number, each new document narrowing the space available for another speech about California's future. And by that point, the audience had begun to understand the structure of the confrontation. Every time Gavin Newsom reached for the image, JD Vance reached for the ledger. Vance opened another tab and shifted from the policies Gavin Newsom had signed to the people Gavin Newsom had chosen, because a governor is judged not only by the orders that carry his signature, but also by the people he puts close enough to touch public money and government power. Dana Williamson, Newsom's former chief of staff, had been indicted on 23 federal counts involving bank fraud and wire fraud, with allegations describing $1.7 million in fabricated business expenses that included Chanel handbags, private charter flights, and a birthday trip to Mexico. The point was not that every accusation against an aide automatically became an accusation against the governor, but that this was not some distant bureaucrat hidden several floors below the executive office. This was a person entrusted with the machinery around the governor himself. Newsom had built his political identity around competence, control, presentation, and the suggestion that his administration knew exactly what it was doing, yet Vance was now listing failures that made that confidence look less like management and more like branding. The closer the people were to the center of power, the harder it became to pretend that supervision belonged to someone else. Then came Rodrigo Santos, another Newsom appointee, whose case added another layer to the pattern Vance was constructing, this time involving $775,000 in fraud, altered checks, and a 30-month sentence. Vance did not need to inflate the argument because the repetition was damaging enough. First, an agency that ignored fraud warnings, then massive unemployment fraud, then prisoners receiving benefits, then thousands of identity theft victims, then senior people around the administration facing serious accusations of financial misconduct. A single failure can be explained as a mistake, a second as bad judgment. But when the same weakness appears repeatedly across policy, personnel, oversight, and money, the explanation starts collapsing under its own weight. Vance's argument was that this was not simply unlucky staffing and not merely the unavoidable chaos of government at scale. It was what happens when supervision is treated as secondary until the bill arrives. Newsom tried to summon the familiar, dismissive smile, but this time the gallery did not return it, and a smile with no audience suddenly looked less like confidence than insulation. That was the moment the performance began to separate visibly from the room around it, because Newsom had spent years mastering the political smile that tells an audience that an accusation is beneath serious consideration. Normally, that smile works because someone else smiles back: a supporter, a moderator, a donor, an editorial board member, anybody willing to participate in the signal that the criticism is unserious. This time, nobody completed the exchange, so the expression stayed on his face alone, detached from the room, and the longer it stayed there, the more artificial it appeared. The corners of his mouth softened first, then the center, then the eyes, until the entire expression disappeared over several slow seconds under a camera positioned to catch the change. Vance did not comment on the face because he did not need to. The numbers were doing the work, and Newsom's reaction was simply becoming part of the evidence the audience was assembling for itself. Then Vance did what he said no California agency had done. He started adding the categories together instead of allowing each scandal to remain isolated inside its own bureaucratic box. He put $32.6 billion in EDD fraud beside an estimated $146 billion in Medi-Cal fraud, then pointed to estimates that the IHSS program alone could be losing between 25 and 40% to fraud, equal to roughly $6 billion to $12 billion per year. He added $37 billion in homelessness spending that, according to the argument presented, lacked adequate tracking, while homelessness outcomes deteriorated instead of improving. The combined figure Vance placed before the room was $215 billion under one governor, not because some official California document had already produced that exact total, but because he was deliberately forcing separate numbers into one frame. That was the devastating simplicity of the exercise. The government had compartmentalized the failures while Vance turned them into one ledger. In the press area, the significance of that addition became obvious immediately because once separate numbers become one number, the political meaning changes. $32 billion can be blamed on unemployment fraud. $37 billion can be hidden inside homelessness programs. Another enormous figure can be buried inside healthcare fraud estimates. And each department can produce its own explanation, its own report, its own vocabulary, and its own delay. $215 billion does not behave that way because it crosses agencies, programs, years, and excuses, forcing the public to ask whether the real problem is larger than any individual department. Newsom could argue about each component, but the combined figure created a political burden that could no longer be contained inside a single press release. Vance paused over it because the accusation was no longer that California had problems. The accusation was that California had spent or lost money on a scale so large that even the state itself had never publicly assembled the full picture. Then he moved to high-speed rail, a project so old and expensive that it had become a perfect example of the distance between a political promise and a measurable result. California voters approved the project in 2008 with a cost figure of roughly $33 billion and a promise of connecting Los Angeles and San Francisco with travel under 3 hours, while the completion target at the time pointed toward 2020. By 2026, the projected cost had exceeded $128 billion, almost 4 times the original amount, yet no passenger had ridden the system from Los Angeles to San Francisco because no finished Los Angeles to San Francisco system existed. The only section under construction ran through the Central Valley between Merced and Bakersfield, which gave Vance an opening for the one moment of humor in a sequence otherwise dominated by numbers. Bakersfield was fine, he said in substance, but taxpayers had not approved a $128 billion project, so the state could spend 18 years failing to complete the route they were originally promised. The gallery laughed, partly because the line was funny, and partly because laughter was relief after being hit with one giant number after another, but Newsom used that opening to defend the project as a long-term infrastructure investment. That response gave Vance exactly the contrast he wanted, because long-term sounds responsible until it is placed beside 18 years, more than $128 billion in projected cost, and 0 passengers on the promised route. Vance did not need technical transportation language or a complicated infrastructure model. He reduced the issue to elementary arithmetic that every viewer could understand without an expert standing beside them. 18 years, 128 billion, ours zero, completed Los Angeles to San Francisco passenger service, and a project still described as long-term was not a framing problem, but a result problem. That was the recurring weakness in Newsom's defense. Whenever he offered vision, Vance answered with completion. Whenever he offered investment, Vance answered with output. And whenever he offered the future, Vance dragged the conversation back to what had actually been delivered. Vance opened the next tab and returned to the EDD because, unlike the rail project where supporters could still claim the final outcome remained somewhere ahead, the unemployment fraud disaster had already happened and the warnings afterward were documented year after year. He read the sequence: high-risk warning in 2021, high-risk warning in 2022, again in 2023, again in 2024, again in 2025, and again in January 2026. 6 warnings across 6 years meant the administration could no longer hide behind the fog of the pandemic, emergency conditions, overwhelmed systems, or a crisis moving too quickly for normal safeguards. Emergency failure may explain 2020, but it does not explain why the same agency remained high risk year after year while the governor continued selling California as a national model of effective government. The repetition became its own indictment of management because the warning had stopped being a warning and had become a calendar. Then Vance introduced the $19 million public relations contract, the number that connected the beginning of the confrontation to everything that had followed. After years of fraud warnings, unrecovered losses, identity theft victims, unemployment debt, homelessness spending questions, and an unfinished rail project, the administration's response included hiring a New York public relations firm to rehabilitate California's brand. The phrase mattered because rehabilitate the brand did not sound like repairing EDD, recovering fraud, housing homeless Californians, repaying federal unemployment loans, or finishing transportation infrastructure. It sounded like fixing the picture while the underlying structure remained damaged. Vance's entire attack could be reduced to that contrast. Billions associated with unresolved failures on one side and millions spent making the state look better on the other. Newsom had opened the night talking about California as the future, but Vance was now arguing that the state had begun spending money not to fix the future, but to market the present. California also owed the federal government roughly $21 billion in unemployment insurance loans, and that debt was not staying inside Sacramento because employers were being forced to absorb higher federal unemployment taxes. Vance tied the increase to businesses paying hundreds of dollars more per worker each year, turning a state-level failure into a direct operating cost for employers already dealing with wages, rent, utilities, insurance, and every other expense attached to surviving in California. Then he returned to Ray Morales because Ray's case made the cruelty of the system impossible to sanitize. The man whose identity had been stolen through a broken unemployment system was now paying higher payroll taxes connected to the financial damage that same system produced. First, his name was used, then his legitimate benefits were blocked, then his credit was damaged, and years later his business was still helping pay the bill. Ray was not merely a victim of pay now, verify later. In Vance's framing, he had become the later. Vance moved from Ray Morales back into the machinery that had made Ray's story possible because the fraud was no longer being presented as something caused only by criminals outside the system exploiting emergency weakness. 2 former EDD employees had been indicted in 2024 for allegedly providing system access to organized crime rings, which meant the breach did not simply involve people knocking on the door from the outside. According to the case presented, insiders had opened the door from within. That distinction mattered because external fraud is a security problem, while internal access immediately becomes a supervision problem, a chain of command problem, and potentially a question about who knew what was happening above the level of the employees themselves. Vance emphasized that the FBI investigation had expanded upward through that administrative chain from employees to supervisors, directors, deputies, senior staff, and ultimately toward the governor's office where the April 8, 2020 order had been signed. The same order still sat at the center of the case because the chronology had never changed. Warning first, signature second, billions lost afterward. The investigation, as Vance framed it, was not proof that everyone above those employees had committed a crime, but it was proof that the questions had moved beyond the lowest level of the bureaucracy. That was politically devastating enough because Gavin Newsom's defense depended on distance. The idea that California government was too large for every failure inside every agency to be treated as a governor's personal act. Vance's response was that distance works only until the chain keeps climbing, and once the chain reaches the people who received reports, approved policy, supervised directors, or sat in the executive office, the argument that responsibility belongs somewhere else starts to look increasingly thin. The governor had not been some commentator watching the EDD disaster from another state. He was the executive under whose authority the policy changed and under whose administration the agency remained high risk for years afterward. That did not settle every legal question, but it made the political question brutally simple. How many layers of failure can exist beneath one governor before I didn't know becomes an indictment of management all by itself? Vance then turned to the California Attorney General, whose public language had changed in a way he treated as another warning sign. In 2022, the Attorney General had said there was no evidence of executive involvement in the EDD fraud, a statement that functioned politically as a shield because it allowed Newsom's allies to separate catastrophic fraud from the governor personally. By March 2026, according to the account presented, the same Attorney General responded differently, saying he could not comment on ongoing reviews. Vance focused on the distance between those positions, not because cannot comment automatically meant guilt, but because it no longer gave Newsom the clean public exoneration he once had. From no evidence to cannot comment is not a conviction, but in politics, it is the disappearance of a sentence that had previously protected you. Then Vance stacked the entire case again, this time without allowing Newsom's team any breathing room between the categories. Approximately $215 billion in fraud, waste, or spending problems as Vance had combined them. 6 years of auditor warnings, 47,000 identity theft victims, roughly $21 billion in federal unemployment debt being passed through to businesses, a former chief of staff facing 23 federal counts, 2 EDD employees indicted over insider access, an expanding FBI examination of the administrative chain, and an attorney general no longer repeating the old language of no evidence. Against that pile, Vance placed the $19 million public relations contract and argued that this was the clearest symbol of the administration's governing instinct. When the wall was leaking, the response was not to repair the pipe first, but to repaint the surface and improve the photograph. The line he used to summarize it was savage because it required only 5 words. Instagram with a budget. The room did not explode in applause, it exhaled, which was more damaging because it sounded like a collective release after a long sequence of numbers had finally been compressed into a phrase everyone could understand. Instagram, with a budget, took the fraud figures, the warnings, the branding contract, the unfinished projects, the debt, and the victims, and reduced them into a critique of government by presentation rather than government by outcome. Newsom's face changed as the line settled, not into some melodramatic collapse, but into something far more politically dangerous for a man whose public strength had always been control. The performance stopped. The practice charm disappeared. The campaign smile disappeared. The expression designed for cameras disappeared. and what remained was simply the face of a politician processing an argument that could not be erased with another polished phrase. For a man who had spent 2 decades mastering the visual side of politics, the loss of control over that visual was itself a problem. The reporters in the press gallery stopped typing for a moment and started sending messages because the $19 million PR contract had suddenly become more than a procurement detail. It had become the headline, the symbolic object that made Vance's entire accusation portable enough for television, social media, donors, activists, and editorial boards. 2 words, PR firm, could now carry the weight of a much longer argument about what California had chosen to prioritize after repeated warnings and repeated failure. Newsom understood that problem immediately and finally fought back with the force of someone who knew that allowing the ledger to remain unanswered would be worse than arguing inside Vance's frame. He stood, recovered the energy, raised the voice, and began listing the California programs and achievements that he believed proved the state was doing far more than the attack suggested. He pointed to Project Homekey, hotel conversions, housing placements, the CARE Act, treatment for severe mental illness, electric vehicle adoption, climate policy, public education investment, and the broad infrastructure of programs his administration had promoted as solutions. The defense was pure Newsom, fast, fluent, expansive, program after program delivered with the confidence of a man who knows every government initiative can sound impressive when its official name is spoken beside a dollar amount and a promise. He argued in substance that Vance was adding up problems while he was adding up solutions, trying to shift the room away from fraud and failed oversight and back toward California as a government that invested at enormous scale. For several minutes, the familiar rhythm returned, and a thin murmur of support moved through the gallery because supporters finally heard the vocabulary they had come expecting to hear. But Vance had spent the entire night preparing one response to exactly that style of defense. When Newsom finished, Vance did not challenge every program separately because that would have allowed the governor to bury the debate inside 12 new policy arguments. Instead, he attacked the category itself, saying the governor had just spent several minutes naming programs but had not named one measurable result attached to the claims he was making. He said Newsom repeatedly used words such as investment, while never confronting the question of return, and that distinction became the center of the closing attack. Spending, Vance argued, is putting money into something. Governing is knowing what happened after the money went in. California's problem, in his formulation, was not an inability to announce spending, but an inability to prove that spending had produced outcomes proportional to its extraordinary cost. That was where the theme of leakage returned, now broader than the EDD and broader than the $19 million contract. Money leaked through fraud, oversight leaked through agencies that stayed high risk, residents leaked out through negative migration, trust leaked each time another warning appeared without a corresponding fix, and the administration responded by improving the brand instead of repairing the source. Newsom had started the confrontation by mocking Ohio as a place people leave, expecting Vance to defend the past. But Vance had spent the night turning California's own departures into evidence against the governor's version of the future. More than 800,000 residents gone, billions questioned, repeated warnings unanswered, and programs described in language of investment while results remained contested made the final contrast almost impossible to soften. Instead of fixing the pipe, you paint the wall, Vance told him in substance, and by then the metaphor no longer needed explanation. The line landed because the evening had already supplied every part of it. The leak was the money. The leak was the people. The leak was the trust, and the paint was the $19 million effort to rehabilitate California's image. Newsom's posture shifted slightly, shoulders settling. the physical energy lower than when he had opened the night describing California as the future and Ohio as the past. Somewhere in the gallery, a state employee wearing a Caltrans windbreaker shook her head with the exhausted recognition of someone who had heard grand promises before and had just watched them collide with a ledger. The moderator moved toward closing statements, but the central argument had already hardened into place and could no longer be reset by cadence alone. Newsom would get one more chance to sell the future, but the room had already done the math. Newsom used the closing statement exactly the way he had used the opening, returning to California's future, innovation, resilience, public investment, and the pioneering spirit that had built the state into an economic giant. The words were polished. The cadence was polished. The delivery sounded like the same delivery that had carried him through elections, press conferences, donor rooms, and national television appearances. But the problem was that the room had already been forced to process the ledger sitting underneath the speech. Once an audience has spent an evening staring at $32.6 billion in unemployment fraud, roughly $21 billion in federal unemployment debt, 6 consecutive high-risk warnings, 47,000 identity theft victims, a $19 million PR contract, and a combined $215 billion figure, the vocabulary of vision becomes much harder to use as an eraser. Math does not care how good a sentence sounds, does not reward a better suit, does not soften because a politician knows where to pause, and does not become smaller because the person defending it speaks with confidence. Newsom could keep selling California as the future, but Vance had already made the audience ask the one question branding cannot answer. Where did the money go? Vance did not offer a grand closing speech in return, did not compete with Newsom for the last rhetorical flourish, and did not attempt to end the night by shouting louder. He closed the laptop, took a drink of water, set the glass down, and let the numbers remain where they were, because his entire attack depended on treating the situation like a ledger rather than a campaign rally. The contrast was deliberate and ugly for Newsom. One man finished by describing what California wanted to become, while the other finished by leaving the audience with what California had spent, lost, borrowed, failed to track, or failed to complete. In the hallway, according to the sequence in the original account, Newsom's deputy chief of staff looked down at a phone filled with missed calls, including a message from a 2028 finance figure saying only, "We need to talk." In political fundraising, 4 words like that do not mean somebody wants to discuss dinner. They mean donors watch the same damage everybody else watched and are beginning to calculate whether the candidate is becoming more expensive than useful. Newsom left the stage differently from the way he entered it, faster, with less eye contact, no leisurely wave toward the press pool, and none of the physical ownership of space that had marked the beginning of the night. The campaign walk had disappeared because campaigns are built around creating cameras, while political damage produces the opposite instinct. Find the car, find the door, find somewhere without another lens. Then the clips began moving, not as one long town hall, but as separate pieces of political ammunition that could travel independently of the original event. The first major clip centered on pay now, verify later, the fraud warning, the executive order, and the billions that later disappeared through fraudulent unemployment claims, while another centered on the phrase Instagram with a budget. A third needed almost no language at all, just several seconds of Newsom's smile disappearing as the room stopped participating in the performance. The numbers attached to those clips became part of the damage described in the original script. Tens of millions of combined views within days, spread across taxpayer groups, identity theft communities, political accounts, small business networks, and people who saw in Ray Morales a version of their own experience with a government system that failed first and demanded proof later. Instagram with a budget became portable because it was short enough to survive outside the original context while still carrying the larger accusation that the administration preferred presentation to repair. The silent clip of Newsom's expression changing traveled even more easily because it did not require viewers to understand California unemployment law, federal statutes, EDD procedures, or state budgeting. It simply showed a politician whose smile had outlived the room's willingness to smile back. That is why political imagery can become more destructive than argument. A 4-second facial change can be replayed endlessly, while a detailed policy defense requires 5 minutes nobody online intends to give you. In the first week after the event, the original account says the U.S. Department of Labor Inspector General announced a formal investigation into California's use of Federal CARES Act unemployment funds, including examination of the April 8, 2020 executive order and the March 14 warning memo. The investigation was framed around the decision-making process that produced the suspension of identity verification, returning everything to the 25-day sequence that Vance had placed at the center of the town hall. The House Oversight Committee then issued a subpoena directed personally at Gavin Newsom, seeking sworn testimony about who authorized the policy, who received the warning, and why the warning was overridden. That changed the pressure because a television answer can be reframed, revised, clarified, or walked back, while sworn testimony carries an entirely different risk if the details begin contradicting documents already in investigators' hands. Newsom was no longer dealing only with headlines about competence. The structure of the problem had moved into formal review. By the second week, the California legislature, controlled by Democrats, established a special select committee focused on pandemic fraud accountability, an escalation that removed one of the easiest political defenses available to Newsom. He could not simply dismiss the entire process as an attack manufactured by Republicans because members of his own party were now creating a mechanism with subpoena power to examine executive decisions linked to documented pandemic losses. That was the deeper danger of the town hall. Vance did not need every accusation to become a criminal charge in order to produce political damage, because once Democratic legislators decided silence itself had become dangerous, institutional loyalty started weakening. At the same time, the Dana Williamson case moved into discovery, with prosecutors seeking communications between Williamson and the governor's office related to procurement and spending decisions. Each additional document request increased the pressure on the same question Vance had been asking all night. Who was supervising the people handling the money? The California Attorney General's changing language then became even more damaging because the old statement that there was no evidence of executive involvement was no longer being repeated with the same certainty. The phrase, "I cannot comment on ongoing reviews," did not prove wrongdoing, but it removed the clean political shield that Newsom had previously been able to stand behind. By week 3, the original account describes a class action on behalf of 47,000 identity theft victims, with a lead plaintiff whose stolen identity had been used to obtain fraudulent unemployment benefits before she was denied legitimate assistance. Her story, including losing housing and living in a vehicle with her children, transformed the fraud debate again from government accounting into visible human damage. Estimated class damages reaching into the billions made the legal exposure another number that could now be added to a ledger already overflowing with them. California business groups then moved into the fight because the federal unemployment tax increases connected the state's debt directly to payroll, exactly where small employers could feel it every month. Restaurant owners, mechanics, shopkeepers, dry cleaners, and family businesses did not need a constitutional argument about executive authority to understand that their tax burden had risen while billions in fraudulent claims remained unrecovered. The phrase, "I am the later," spread because it captured the twisted logic of pay now, verify later, from the perspective of the people who ended up receiving the bill. Government had paid first, failed to verify, accumulated debt, and then businesses were paying the consequence years afterward through higher unemployment taxes. In that frame, later was not an administrative phase. Later was the taxpayer. The FBI investigation into former EDD employees also expanded, according to the source account, to additional levels of the administrative chain, which kept alive the question of how far upward knowledge or responsibility might eventually travel. Month 2 brought the political measurement of that damage, with Newsom's approval rating described as falling sharply, while a new recall petition began gathering signatures faster than the earlier 2021 effort. Donors who had once been thinking about 2028 were now asking for briefings about the $215 billion figure because donors do not need to believe every line of an opponent's attack to recognize when an attack is simple enough to work. $215 billion was the kind of number that could be placed on a screen in every swing state without a narrator needing to explain much else. One senior advisor resigned, and the public story shifted from whether Newsom could absorb the damage to whether his inner circle believed the damage could still be contained. By month 3, the original script describes 3 major California editorial boards arriving within the same week at increasingly severe questions about whether Newsom could continue governing effectively while investigations, subpoenas, donor anxiety, and recall pressure accumulated around him. None of those editorials needed to use the word resign directly for the meaning to be understood, because phrases such as consider whether he can serve effectively, whether he can finish 2026, and it may be time carry their own political translation. Newsom had not resigned, but the distance between has not and will not had narrowed with every investigation, every headline, every signature, every unanswered donor call, and every ally who chose distance over defense. The polished image that had once made California look like a launchpad for national office was now being measured against the same ledger Vance opened on stage. The future Newsom had mocked Ohio for supposedly lacking had suddenly become much harder for Newsom himself to claim. And while Sacramento argued, donors calculated, investigators requested documents, and editorial boards debated the governor's survival. Ray Morales still opened his taco shop in San Bernardino at 5 in the morning. His credit score was still damaged years after his identity had been stolen. His business was still absorbing higher unemployment taxes, and the government failure that had once paid a criminal using his name had never become an abstract political exercise for him. The PR firm was in New York. The governor was in Sacramento. The headlines moved from one investigation to the next, but Ray remained where the actual cost of policy always lands: at the counter, on the payroll, inside the credit report, and in the extra money leaving a small business every year. That is where Vance's final metaphor returned with all the decoration stripped away, because paint can hide a stain for a while, but paint does not stop water from moving through a broken pipe. After 6 years, billions in fraud and waste, tens of thousands of identity theft victims, federal debt, investigations, recall pressure, and $19 million spent rehabilitating the brand, the accusation at the center of the entire confrontation remained brutally simple. The wall had been painted, but the pipe was still broken.